Hello, hello. Welcome to The Exceptional Advisor, a podcast from the Investments and Wealth Institute, where we explore ideas, challenges, and opportunities shaping the future of advice. My name is Sean Walters. I'm Chief Executive Officer of the Investments and Wealth Institute. In each episode, I sit down with leaders, thinkers, and practitioners from across the profession to talk about what it really takes to serve clients and lead with excellence in a changing environment. Today, our guest is somebody who we've worked with at the Institute for many, many years. Our conversation today is about trust, communications. We're going to get into some behavior, decision-making. Who knows where we'll go? And ultimately, we're looking to help advisors, make a professional advantage out of the behavior and the trust and the relationship they have with their client. We're welcoming today Herman Brodie, a behavioral scientist who's spent years helping financial professionals better understand how people make decisions, why they become reactive, and what it takes to build trust when emotions, uncertainty, and attention are all in play. Herman, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to see you again. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Herman and I met in Australia, it's got to be 10 years ago now. And he's a behavioral scientist and speaker that was presenting at our one of our affiliates in Australia, and we added him to our program probably about 10 years ago as well. And we've been fortunate to have Herman as a presenter at our conferences pretty much every year or two since then. So it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you.
So let's start with a question. We're a professional association. Financial advisors are our members, and we're a community, and communities of people often are helped out by other people in their career pathing. And so I usually start with the question of, is there somebody that helped you get your start in the field you're in, Herman? Someone who was particularly instrumental in just kind of nudging you along on the path you've taken?
Oh, for sure. And quite remarkably, it was actually a trainee who was on the desk at an investment bank that I was working on. And that trainee introduced me to an academic paper as the first one I'd ever seen that touched the subject of behavioral finance. And it seemed to explain everything that had gone wrong in my professional career ever since the start. I mean, I'd already been involved in the markets probably a good 10, 15 years by the time this trainee came along, and having studied finance and economics, and then entered into the capital markets 1 month ahead of the October 1987 meltdown, and seeing people doing things which are not at all prepared me for in my academic career, and then going on subsequently year after year, seeing market developments and seeing financial decision making at a professional level that was not at all consistent with the way that I'd been trained. When I first saw this paper, it was essentially a revelation for me, and it changed completely my outlook on capital markets and then ultimately in the direction of my career.
What's one of the things that's most rewarding to you today about the career path you've taken? Like, what do you enjoy most about the work you're doing within this field?
Well, I work with a lot of financial institutions, fund managers, financial advisors, professional institutions like yourself, private wealth managers as well as brokers. And the ability to be able to go in and explain certain elements of financial decision-making or various elements of group decision-making, client relationships, communication, change management, and seeing the reaction it feels almost intuitive once you know it, but the recognition from others that yes, we can make small changes, inexpensive changes, and have incredible impact on our outputs, our returns, our relationships, our communication, etc. So it's the knowledge that you can have from a very modest intervention such a great impact on the way that people are working and the results for their firms.
Yeah. Well, you and I could go in a lot of directions with these questions. In fact, I remember last year in Austin at our conference, you and I grabbed a pint at a local pub of Guinness, and we talked about all kinds of topics. I wish we could have that format here today, but the microphones would pick up stuff as well. But we're going to have a similar kind of conversation, just without the Guinness in front of us. So one of the things that I think is on the minds of a lot of advisors these days when they're dealing with their clients is just how much is going on in the environment, the world, their communities, the markets. We're constantly operating in an environment where there's so much noise, headlines, and fear, quite honestly.
Mhm.
How would you advise advisors and to essentially focus their clients on their objectives and goals with this attention-driven environment constantly pulling them in other directions?
Oh.
How would you address that and ask advisors to address that?
The truth is, there has always been reasons for our attention to be dragged one way or the other. Even, it's not just a recent phenomenon, it's our human nature that our attention is directed to things that are salient in our environment. So unless we deliberately direct our attention to something, it will automatically be drawn away to things that are salient. Things that are salient are, of course, those bright, shiny objects that pass in front of us from time to time, but anything which is volatile, anything that changes. And we do not pay attention to things that are static or that they don't change, even though those things could be very, very important for our health, our wealth, and our happiness. And so, in a sense, we have to play the role of somebody who constantly, and I say constantly, reminds people that things that don't change are also very important. And things that change, of course, it's important to pay attention to some things that change so that we can integrate that information into our knowledge so that we can make decisions. But they are not necessarily the most important things. These days, I think what has changed over the recent years is that there are an army now of psychologists armed with this knowledge about the things to which people pay attention, deliberately creating content that is just more addictive. But even before this happened, it's our human nature to be attracted to things that are salient. The thing is that most clients, I would guess, know what is good for their health, wealth, and their well-being. The problem is, because of these salient distractions, they don't choose them. And this is where advisors must help to educate people.
There's a follow-up question on that because I could see, even just in dealing with my own employees who are feeling certain ways about certain subjects, that you have to have this balance between being um, coming across as dismissive of what they're feeling and trying to focus them on what the work at hand. And that's similar with clients, right? How do you get advisors to not dismiss their clients or feel that they're being talked down to by shifting them from those noisy distractions to the real work at hand and what they need to stay focused on?
Yeah, I think they know what's right for them. And if I just make a little exercise, let's say we're going to pause this interview for 60 seconds.
Okay.
And I say, during these 60 seconds, there are a couple of things that we could do. So we could either, A, spend 30 seconds with a breathing exercise where we just listen to our own breath. And we breathe in and we breathe out and we listen to our heartbeats and we just calm ourselves down, separate ourselves from the world for 30 seconds. And then in the subsequent 30 seconds, we'll think about all of the things and the people in our lives we are grateful. So we'll think about our families and our friends, our loved ones, our sports, our hobbies, our passions in life. We just think about all the things for which we are grateful. Alternatively, option B, we can check our smartphones to find the latest news of what's going on in the Middle East. Now, if I ask people, which of those two things do you think would contribute most to your health, wealth, and happiness? And then you look at what it is that people choose. And you'll find they don't always choose the things that are in their best interest, because the things that the latest news on their smartphone is simply more salient. And the things that don't change, our relationships with our families, for example, or our passions for our sports or hobbies, those things, because they don't change, they're just simply not salient. Our health, if we enjoy good health, it's not salient for us until it worsens. And yet it contributes enormously to our well-being. So with examples like this, we can demonstrate to people how important it is to consciously direct our attention to certain things at regular moments during the day, during the week, during the month, etc.
Yeah, that's a great exercise, and it's such an important note to get people out of their amygdala, where you're constantly scanning for threats, and into where you want them to be, which is thinking about what's important moving forward. This is related to one of the concepts you've talked a little bit about, is behavior residue, the idea that past experiences can leave a lasting mark on future decisions. How does that show up in client relationships, and why does it matter right now?
Yeah. At the outset, I remember the outset of my career in investment banking was at the time. One of the older and wiser colleagues said to me, "Well, Herman, whatever you do with clients, don't talk about religion or politics, because what's going to happen is you're going to run into somebody who doesn't share your perspectives, your outlook on life, your beliefs, and it's going to be very difficult to communicate with them." And I took this on board and I generally followed that advice. But what we've seen over recent years is not only that there are differences, we've seen an incredible polarization in our societies in the US. I'm sure you've seen it as well as here in the UK. There's been an incredible polarization. In fact, scientists, social scientists even talk about what we call these mega identities, which are largely partisan and politically based. And what you find in terms of a trust relationship, it's very, very difficult to communicate with people if you suddenly find yourself on opposite ends of this partisan divide. Um, and the thing is that the idea that we should not talk about politics or religion, this doesn't help, quite simply because we leave traces of our mega identity everywhere that we go. So in people on different sides of the partisan divide, they're not even watching the same TV shows. They don't listen to the same music. They don't dress in the same way. They don't talk in the same way. And as a result, you leave traces of your identity behind you even before you've opened your mouth the very first time. So if I'm trying to explain something to you and I use a reference from a popular TV show where character A, the one where character A did this to character B as a means of explaining something, it could well be, if somebody's on an opposite end of an ideological divide, they don't watch that show. And the knowledge that you watch it is a proof to them that you are not like they are. And therefore, any communication between you is going to be complicated, becomes much more difficult.
Yeah.
You see, when we believe something, we tend to be convinced that our own ideas, our reflections are well-founded, that they're very robust, and they're unbiased in the way that other people are biased. And therefore, when somebody comes along with a different set of ideas or a different set of beliefs, we think they've lost their mind. Now, if you think somebody has lost their mind, you're not going to take advice from such a person. And you're certainly not going to listen to their arguments. And so the idea that we should not talk about something, this just does not hold water any longer, because you give yourself away as a result of the behavioral residue that you're leaving behind everywhere that you go.
Yeah. So if you so are you advising that we do talk about it, or that we empathize more and listen more? Like, how would you bridge that divide then?
It doesn't matter whether you talk about it or not. It doesn't make sense to talk about it, But basically, not talking about it doesn't mean you're not giving it away. In trust building, one of the simplest ways to begin a high trust relationship, and I've recommended this in my book and in talks, I've always emphasized this, is that early in the relationship, you should say something personal about yourself. So reveal something personal about yourself. Something that is a little perhaps embarrassing, perhaps a little bit humiliating. Because when you do this, it has a twofold effect. Firstly, it makes you vulnerable to the other person. Yes, I'm going to just tell you something about myself, but um, this is something that I don't want screamed from the rooftop, but I'm happy to share it just between you and me, you know? If I do this, it reveals to the other person that I'm ready to be vulnerable towards them. And vulnerability is the basis for a high trust relationship. Typically, they will be vulnerable towards you to reciprocate this gesture. And it's this environment of mutual vulnerability which is the basis for trust. The second effect that it has is it reveals to the other the kind of relationship that you're going to have. This is going to be the kind of relationship where we can share things with one another and we respect each other's privacy and confidentiality. We can be open with one another. And this is the basis for every kind of high trust relationship. No trusting relationship has ever been created without somebody being willing to be vulnerable to somebody else.
Yeah. Wow.
If there's an ideological divide now, you can still use the same techniques by sharing personal narratives. So things that have happened to you that are in relationship to the kind of thing that you want to explain, that you want to communicate with the other. So if we're talking about what happens after the death of a loved one, for example, or a divorce, or something which is very challenging and difficult, where the ideological divide could interfere with good communication. It's pointless to come with data or statistics because if you're on the opposite side of the
Yeah.
divide, the other person thinks you're crazy anyway, and therefore they're not going to attach much validity to your statistics or the source of those statistics because you're obviously looking in sources that are the wrong ones. But if you share a personal narrative about something that's happened to you personally, this can demonstrate to the other that you prioritize honesty and vulnerability above things like data or self promotion. So it has to be something that is not just personal, but perhaps even a little bit embarrassing or humiliating, humbling, it needs to be. And if you try those personal narratives, the research has shown that it can even help to bridge those ideological divides.
Absolutely.
So it's not a question of not talking about religion because it doesn't make any difference. The goal is to be able to communicate with somebody, even though they don't necessarily share your identity.
The identity we share is humanity. And so sharing something human is what connects us. If you share abstract ideas, political or religious or other, that's not going to connect us as much as that vulnerability and what makes us human. That's
E-
so powerful.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
And it's kind of lead us into our primary topic is going to be about trust and one of the things you've talked a lot about is this dual access. It was so helpful to me when you discussed the difference between benevolence and competency. And those are both forms of building trust. And you might need to do a little bit of a brief on that.
Mhm.
But I want to ask a question related to that with AI, because AI does create knowledge and competency, intelligence that's and how does that affect the ability for an advisor to bridge that trust gap with a client
Mhm.
if the AI competence piece is being kind of messed with
Mm.
as a result of that? So first, talk a little bit about benevolence trust versus competence trust and why those are such important differences.
When we make a judgment about somebody or about a firm, we don't actually do it on a single dimension that stretches from good to bad. we invariably make two judgments about the other. We make a judgment about, of course, their competency. Is this person, do they have the skills, the resources, the training, the contacts, etc., in order to make good outcomes happen? But we also make a second judgment simultaneously about their intentions towards us. What are their intentions towards us? Are these individuals or this firm motivated to make those good outcomes happen for me? Or are they pursuing their own selfish agenda? And it's the combination of those two judgments, whenever there is a backdrop of risk. So whether if I'm in a situation where I can be harmed by the actions of the other, then those two judgments combine into an overall judgment that we call trust. And so for a client to trust you, they must be convinced not only that you are able to act in their interest, but that you are willing to do so as well. This is what trust is. The thing is, of those two judgments, the one that carries the most weight and the one that's always made first is the judgment about the other's benevolence. And so this is the primary judgment that is always made. Thing is, in the financial services sector, professionals have a tendency to want to distinguish themselves from others by virtue of their competency, and they spend too little time talking about their benevolence. They have benevolent intentions, of course, don't get me wrong, but they were not very good at showing it. And this is why, for the most clients, most financial professionals, they all look the same, because most of them dwell very much on their competence and spend far too little time talking about their benevolence.
One adage you used that stuck with me was the comment, trust takes a lifetime to build and a moment to lose.
Yeah,
And you said, well, that's partially true and partially not true. And
yeah,
it's related to competency based trust and
yeah.
benevolence trust. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, we did the research for the book, and there's no evidence for this whatsoever, this expression. So you'll see it everywhere, all over the internet, but there's no evidence for it whatsoever. In fact, what we discovered is that trust isn't something to be built and to be destroyed. It's two things to be built and destroyed. There's this perception of competence and this perception of benevolence. Competence judgments, indeed, they do take years to build because they are based on our own observations. We watch somebody over a long period of time and we come to the conclusion that they're competent, or we use somebody else's observations. So things like track records, for example, or academic qualifications. These are just somebody else's observations. So those take a long time to build. But let's say that there is a bad outcome, a single bad outcome. Our judgment about the other's competence is not going to just be destroyed straight away. Sometimes the means are just not sufficient to achieve a good outcome every single time. But if there is another bad outcome, and then yet another bad outcome, and yet another bad outcome, then slowly our perception of that individual's competence is going to be eroded. So competence judgments take a long time to build, but also take a long time to destroy. Benevolence judgments, on the other hand, can sometimes only take seconds to build. So you can meet somebody for the very first time, sit down for a coffee, and come away with the impression that person, yeah, I think they got my back. I think this person will genuinely try to help me. And the signals that create this judgment of benevolence, very often they got nothing at all to do with the task. So it could well be that that person simply made themselves vulnerable to me. And I appreciate that they trust me, and therefore I'm motivated to trust them. But if subsequently we learn that that person, in fact, does not have my back, that secretly they've been pursuing their own selfish agenda, then of course that benevolence judgment will be erased in seconds. So benevolence judgments can be destroyed in seconds, but chances are they only took seconds to build in the first place. So what's important to figure out is when somebody says that trust has been lost, you need to know what kind of trust, which of those judgments has been compromised. And the simple way to do it is basically just look at the sentiment of the client. If the client's disappointed, that's what they feel, disappointment, then you've lost the competence perception. If the clients feel betrayed, then it's the benevolence judgment that has been lost.
How do you build that back? I mean, how do you build back, for example, let's say there's a prolonged period of market downturn. The client feels as though their advisor is, from a competence standpoint, even though the advisor does not control the markets,
Mhm.
not doing what's best for the client, or they start to feel that trust drop.
Mhm.
Maybe this advisor isn't the right advisor for me. How do you kind of balance those two aspects when dealing with that type of an environment?
If you're getting disappointing outcome, the client is disappointed, then typically rebuilding trust involves increasing your resources. So you need to invest in people, in training, education, in technology, in order that in the future you can get better outcomes. If you betrayed the client, meaning you've done something, you're not doing the things that you promised to the client, or secretly you're doing things which are not in the client's interest. Well, there are still things you can do to try and win that back, but your expectations for success have to be sharply downgraded, because it's very, very difficult to come back from a betrayal. It's easier to come back from a disappointment than it is from a betrayal, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I remember there was an instance at one of our conferences, and I was talking precisely about benevolence and competence, and that benevolence is the more important of the two. Double the weight, in fact, of competence. It's like 2/3 benevolence, 1/3 competence in that judgment. And there was a couple at the back on the left-hand side there, and they said, "No, Herman, I don't think you're right," they said to me. They said, "We are an incredibly benevolent firm," a husband and wife team this was. And we had a client who left us for another firm because they said that firm had better technology. So even though we are benevolent, it seems that they left us because the other firm, the rival firm, they perceived them as more competent. So that can't be right, what you're saying. Well, I had to push back a little bit on their description of themselves as benevolent. I said, benevolence is purely a judgment that's made by the other. It's not necessarily a trait that you as an advisor can adhere to. You can try and be benevolent, but only the client can perceive you as such. But putting that to one side, presumably there is no reason why that firm could not also have had the same technology as the rival. So why don't they have the same technology as the rival? Did they evaluate this technology, consider the impact that it might have on the client's outcomes or the way that they work, and take this into consideration with the costs of implementing this technology and the costs that would be repercutated on the client? And they came to the conclusion that given what the client needs and what I promised to the client, the cost benefits of implementing this technology are simply not justified. And they communicated this evaluation and this decision to their client. If they did this, the client would nevertheless perceive them probably as being benevolent. Thank you for taking the effort to make this evaluation. Or is the reason that they don't have the technology is because they couldn't be bothered? That's not the way we've worked in the past. Or perhaps they didn't even know that this technology existed before because they're not keeping up to date with the latest developments in the industry. If that's the reason, the client could perceive them as being not competent. So there are reasons that the client can perceive depending on the way that they've operated in this environment. The simple fact that they don't have the technology and the client left to a firm that has does not mean that the client prioritizes competence over benevolence. It depends on the reasons And therefore, they should look more closely at the reasons they don't have that technology.
Yeah. No, so let's use that example, and, I'll tell you I'll be vulnerable and tell you a story
Please do.
about my experience with AI. So I went to a doctor, to have some blood work reviewed just earlier this week, and I was waiting, and so I pull open my, you know, favorite AI application and type in all the numbers that are given to me in this maze of data that you get when you get blood work. There's all these different numbers and there's some descriptions, but they're not really written for humans. They're written for doctors to be able to translate to the humans, their clients, their patients.
Mhm.
And so by the time, she had shown up, the doctor, I had already had a pretty good sense of what everything was telling me. And so then I was kind of sitting back to see, is my doctor and what AI are telling me the same? So there was a moment, right? And I know this is kind of the new normal for the knowledge professions, advisors included. Their clients are going to be walking in with one set of information that's often presented really well by an AI tool, and then their advisor. So I guess my question is, how does that benevolence and competency framing, how can advisors navigate this successful? Because
Mhm.
I could see on the one hand, what I liked about what my doctor did is she said, "Oh, what did it say?" She didn't fight it at all. It was all, and she's like, "Wow, that's really good." And so it wasn't so much, "I'm smarter than the robot." It was more, "Let's talk about you, and here's what this means for you." And it just seemed like that was a moment where she shifted from being a
Mhm.
competency-based professional to someone who was there for me. So
Mhm.
I would imagine that's a similar path that advisors have to take, yes?
Absolutely. This is a classic example of the difference. There are things that a human being can do, especially doctors who are trained in this and trained in a certain bedside manner that the machine can't do. So the first thing that one has to know about intelligent technologies is that clients' expectations for the efficacy and the accuracy of those technologies are much higher than they are for a human. So if the computer got it wrong, it would be unforgivable. But if a doctor gets it wrong, it can there's a little bit more indulgence there. If the patient believes that the doctor still has their best interest at heart, they're more inclined to forgive. They do not forgive the machine. So if you put your clients in front of intelligent technologies, be aware that the bar for disappointment is going to be a lot higher. The second thing that the research has shown is that even if the machine does nothing wrong, if it does something which is totally unexpected, trust breaks down. So even if it's correct, but it does something that the other does not expect, then it has a damaging effect for trust. So if you put these technologies in front of your clients, these are the two things you need to be very much aware of. In terms of your conversation with the doctor, and this is where the doctor has some enormous added value that the AI does not have in terms of the way that it responds to your particular concerns. It can see whether you are, the doctor can see whether you are stressed or anxious about this by the way that you explain things. In terms of the recommendations that she gives, you could say, well, what should I do? She can give you data about the rates of recovery for various pathologies and what kind of recovery rates are seen in various hospitals and so on, and which ones that she may recommend. But that's not what you want from the doctor. So if I was your brother, what would you do? If I was your son, if I was your father, what you would recommend? And if I say, Sean, you have unfortunately this pathology. If you were my father, I would recommend that you do this. That has enormously more powerful as a communication tool than simply giving some data and probabilities and so on.
Yeah.
And that's something that the doctor can do, but the AI can't. Well, at least not yet.
Yeah.
And therefore, this is precisely where the added value is. I mean, the doctor itself, while you were waiting in the waiting room, could have been going into the AI as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Get the same table of information.
She could do, the AI can't.
Yeah. Well, this has been enormously beneficial. I'd want to close with one question for you. It's just broader, Herman. If you could give one piece of advice to advisors, what would it be right now?
Well, it has to be the idea that you must build up your benevolence perceptions. In this industry, we are not perceived by our clients as necessarily having their interests at heart. If you build up your benevolence perceptions amongst your clients, and the book is basically about the multiple ways that you could do this. If you build up those benevolence perceptions, you can enjoy a higher trust relationship. When the clients feel they're in a high trust relationship, that there is somebody has my back, even when I'm not looking, then they're in a position to do things like to invest in riskier assets, and you invest in riskier assets over the long run, you can earn higher returns. And not to be obsessed by watching every uptick and downtick in the market. The second advantage this also brings is it provides a sort of cushion against any eventual competence mishap. So if you get a bad outcome, you will find that the clients are much more indulgent if you've already built up these high benevolence perceptions. And so start today and try as much as possible to expand those benevolence perceptions by doing some of the recommendations in the book. It will help you today, and it will help you in the future should we get some negative outcomes down the line.
Yes. Excellent. Great advice, great book, and definitely enjoy having you as a guest on this podcast series, Herman. Look forward to having you in front of our members at some conference in the future.
Thank you.
So thank you all for listening to the Exceptional Advisor podcast from Investments and Wealth Institute. For more episodes and additional resources for advisors, please visit investmentsandwealth.org. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to subscribe, share it with a colleague, and join us again for the next episode. Until next time, thank you for listening.